What just happened to Lewis Hamilton at Spa, in a place where legends carve their names into Formula One history, where danger meets brilliance on every lap? The seven-time world champion found himself not in the spotlight, but in the shadows. A qualifying session filled with drama, confusion, and quiet frustration ended with Hamilton watching from the sidelines, outpaced and visibly fed up. For a man who's been through every kind of storm F1 can throw, this one felt different. This wasn't just another bad lap. This was a signal. Let's rewind. Spa-Francorchamps is arguably the most legendary circuit on the calendar. High-speed corners, elevation shifts, unpredictable weather. It's a temple of motorsport. But for Hamilton, this weekend has been a masterclass in misfortune. First came the sprint, a race so dull, so hollow in action, that fans across the world were left wondering why we even bother with sprints at Spa anymore. Overtaking was near impossible. The dirty air, shortened DRS zones, and ultra-defensive setups turned what should have been a thrilling session into a train parade. Even Oscar Piastri, who got the jump on Verstappen early on, couldn't hold on to the lead not because of a mistake, but because Max simply had a rocket ship in straight-line speed. And yet, it wasn't just McLaren or Red Bull drama that stole headlines. It was Ferrari, Alpine, and of course Mercedes. From the outside, this looked like just another off weekend for Hamilton. But once you look deeper, a more concerning pattern starts to emerge. Lewis was driving a car with a new upgrade package, one that Charles Leclerc had been using since Montreal. Yes, Montreal. That's how long it took for Mercedes to apply a change to Hamilton's machine that had already been on the other side of the garage. It's not just the delay that's bizarre, it's the outcome. Hamilton spun in qualifying. The car wouldn't rotate into turn one. He said he was losing the rears and fighting the setup. He didn't sound angry, he sounded resigned. And that's the scary part. A champion like Hamilton doesn't get rattled by one mistake. But when the issues are systemic, when they're repeated, and when they come attached to internal decisions that feel like afterthoughts, that's when frustration starts to simmer into something deeper. And while Lewis was struggling with a car that refused to cooperate, the rest of the grid wasn't exactly delivering a showstopper either. The sprint was a disaster, a race where nothing happened after lap 2. Max walked away. McLaren couldn't retaliate. Russell and Hamilton were both trapped in endless DRS trains, reduced to bystanders. Ferrari was a circus of confusion again. Pierre Gasly didn't even get to start properly due to a water leak, and Esteban Ocon managed a good result. But it came in a sea of mediocrity. The racing itself, non-existent. And that's what makes Spa so heartbreaking. This circuit should produce greatness, but the combination of modern aero, risk-averse sprint formats, and increasingly conservative regulations is sucking the magic out of it. You could see it in Lando Norris' race. After fighting back past Leclerc, he ended up in no man's land. The car had pace, but even then, it wasn't enough to challenge Max. Dirty air made it impossible to mount any sort of consistent threat. Even with DRS, even with a setup advantage in corners, Max's low downforce package and execution had him covered. The race was over long before the flag dropped, and the drivers knew it. Leclerc's radio summed it up. Just tell me when it's the last lap. That's not frustration, that's disillusionment. He wasn't just managing tires, he was managing his expectations. And through it all, Hamilton stood as a symbol of something bigger than a rough weekend. His post-session comments weren't explosive, they were surgical. He spoke about learning, fine-tuning, and the first run with a component that's been on another car for months. And that's what makes the silence deafening. Lewis isn't blaming the team, but the subtext is impossible to miss. When you give a driver of Hamilton's caliber a car that can't even fight for Q3, when you saddle him with upgrades that show up too late and don't work here, not just wasting a weekend, you're wasting a legacy. That is Spa weekend will be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Not for rain chaos, not for wild overtakes, not for a championship twist, but for inertia, for an empty sprint, for a qualifying session where a 7-time champion spun out of contention with no answers, and for a sport that, in this moment, felt more broken than brilliant. The question now isn't just about setups or upgrades, it's about direction. Can Formula One fix the spectacle before the fans switch off? Can Mercedes give Hamilton the car he deserves before time runs out? Let us know what you think in the comments. Is it time to ditch the sprints at Spa? Should Mercedes rethink their entire development strategy? And is Hamilton running out of patience or just waiting for one final shot at glory? If you care about this sport, if you believe in its potential, hit that like button and subscribe. This isn't just racing, this is Formula One. And right now, it needs saving. What if I told you that the most decorated driver on the Formula One grid just had one of his most humiliating weekends in years? That the man who once ruled Spa like it was his backyard couldn't even make it out of Q1, not because of one mistake, but because the entire foundation underneath him is starting to crack. This wasn't just a misstep, it was a sign, a warning, a wake-up call that something is deeply wrong inside the Ferrari, campaigned Lewis Hamilton. For all his experience and brilliance, is the one paying the price. When qualifying began at Spa, it wasn't just the rain that everyone feared, it was what the timing screens would reveal. Because for Lewis, The pressure was already mounting. Friday's sprint had been a disaster, trapped in a DRS train, unable to push the car to its limits. The seven-time world champion described the session in one word: pointless. His Ferrari wasn't optimized, the upgrades weren't delivering, and the gap to McLaren and Red Bull, widening. Charles Leclerc confirmed it himself, saying yes, the upgrades worked, but McLaren's worked better. That admission cuts deep, because if Ferrari brought performance and still ended up 3 to 4 tenths behind McLaren every lap, then how far adrift are they really? Then came qualifying, and with it, chaos. A collision between Hülkenberg and Stroll, even before the green light. Yuki Tsunoda finally got his long-awaited upgrades after months of being left behind. The paddock was buzzing, but the focus quickly turned back to Lewis. His early lap was average solid, not spectacular, but Spa's long lap punishes even the slightest mistake. And as the track evolved, lap times began tumbling. Piastri, Norris, Verstappen, even Russell, all finding pace, all improving, and Hamilton, he pushed again. This time, he delivered what looked like a clean lap until the message came through: track limits, deleted, gone, just like that. He was P16, knocked out in Q1. For the first time since 2016, Hamilton wouldn't be starting in the top 4 at Spa. The margins were fine. The footage shows he may have barely stepped out of bounds at Rodion, but that's not the point. The real story is this: why is a car that should be fighting for podiums unable to put Hamilton anywhere near Q2 light? Upgrades being delivered late, inconsistently, and with little benefit. Why is Hamilton one of the greatest to ever touch a steering wheel fighting a car that simply refuses to cooperate? And it's not just him. Mercedes too are in disarray. Antonelli had a nightmare. George Russell, despite a heroic effort, was hemorrhaging time in Sector 2. The car was simply not responding. You could see it on the telemetry. Sector 1 and 3 purple. Sector 2 down by 7 tenths. That's not a driver issue. That's a car that doesn't belong in Q3, let alone a title fight. Meanwhile, McLaren are flying. Lando Norris, after missing out in the sprint, came back with a vengeance, dropping a 1 minute, 40 seconds, and 5 milliseconds, matching Piastri's record-setting lap from yesterday. A clean, aggressive, perfectly executed push lap. Piastri himself was close, but couldn't quite replicate it, and Charles Leclerc, for all of Ferrari's chaos, he pulled out a miraculous lap to take P3 just ahead of Max Verstappen. The irony: that same Ferrari setup is the one Lewis is now trying to adapt to, and it's clearly not working for him. There were other bright spots too. Albon landing a stunning P5 in the Williams Sonata, finally with a competitive car under him, delivering a massive result in P7, and young names like Borletto and Lawson continuing to prove their worth under pressure. But all of that gets overshadowed by the uncomfortable truth that's been lingering for weeks. Ferrari and Mercedes, two giants of the sport, are slipping, and Lewis Hamilton, through no fault of his own, is being dragged down with them. In his post-session interview, Hamilton was calm, collected, and heartbreakingly honest. He apologized to the team, admitted a string of mistakes, but also pointed to the upgrades changes that made the car unpredictable, harder to manage, and possibly the root cause of his qualifying spin. He didn't throw anyone under the bus. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "It's a weekend to forget." That's the language of a driver who knows there's only so much he can do, and yet he's still hopeful, because tomorrow, rain is expected, and with rain comes chaos, opportunity, and the kind of conditions where Hamilton thrives. He said it himself: anything can happen. And if there's one thing we know about Lewis, it's that when everyone counts him out, that's usually when he shows up the biggest. But hope isn't a strategy, and Formula One doesn't reward sentiment. If Ferrari and Mercedes want to salvage their seasons, if they want to give their drivers a fighting chance, they need to stop bringing knives to gunfights. Because right now, McLaren and Red Bull are running away with the show, and legends like Hamilton are being left behind. So the question becomes, how much longer can this go on before something breaks? Not just a component, not just a strategy, but faith. Faith in the system. Faith in the leadership. Faith that the greatest drivers in the world are being given what they need to fight. Let us know in the comments. What do you think is going on at Ferrari? Can Hamilton recover in the wet tomorrow? Or is this the beginning of the end of another wasted season? If this story hits you, if you believe F1 deserves better, hit that like button. Subscribe for more no-nonsense deep dive reporting from the heart of Formula One, because these aren't just races. They're the rise and fall of empires, and we're here to document every second.